But now first, a presentation by Saskia Törnqvist. Saskia is a musicologist and a writer. She studied the reception in the Netherlands of the music by Dmitri Shostakovich. She teaches cultural history and the history of music at the Amsterdam Conservatory. Currently, she's working together with historian Nikolai Epple on a book project titled The Concert of Europe. And the book deals with the role of music in the emergence of nationalism in 19th century Europe. Saskia, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Gijs. Am I clearly audible for all of you? If not, please raise your hand. Before I start my little lecture, I will start up some music, and I'm convinced most of you know the piece. We will do some deep listening. To be continued later. You listened here to the first bars of the composition, The Steppes of Central Asia, written by Alexander Borodin, late 19th century composer. He's one of the composers which I and Luc Banhuizen, who should be here, but he's unfortunately not able to come, but we address certainly Borodin in our book. Under the banner of romantic nationalism, composers from all over Europe created a stream of works which served in one way or another the nationalist agenda of their own nation or ethnic group. So was also the case in 19th century Russia, where specifically one group of nationalist composers, the so-called Mighty Five, dominated the musical landscape in the 60s and 70s of that century. Alexander Borodin was a member of this group, and you just listened to the opening of his symphonic poem In the Steppes of Central Asia. This is a prominent repertoire piece, still very much loved with orchestras worldwide and played a lot on classical radio here in the Netherlands. It's beautiful music, isn't it? But what does it tell us? Well, Borodin wrote a little story, a little background story, and I'd like to read it here for you. I quote here Borodin. In the silence of the monotonous steppes of Central Asia is heard the unfamiliar sound of a peaceful Russian song. You just could hear it. From the distance we hear the approach of horses and camels and the bizarre and melancholy notes of an oriental melody. A caravan approaches, escorted by Russian soldiers, and continues safely on its way through the immense desert. It disappears slowly. The notes of the Russian and Asiatic melodies join in common harmony, which dies away as the caravan disappears in the distance. Unquote. Well, let's apply Borodin's own explanation now on the music itself. So let's go a little bit deeper into the music. I propose to listen once more to the first theme, which I call the Russian subject. And note the archaic character, which refers smoothly to Russian Orthodox music. And note also the stable and self-assured rhythm. of course, this long high note in high strings, what does it represent? The horizon of the expanding Russian Empire. Next, there appears later on in the piece a second theme, which I call the exotic object. It's played by another instrument, an English horn. The English horn is a loved instrument when it comes to Oriental melodies. It has a very sensual timbre. The melody is melancholic and mysterious. It's in minor. The rhythm is flexible. Borodin calls this a bizarre melody. Let's listen to it. So far, so good. Later on, the first theme, the Russian subject, appears, it comes closer. Now we will hear it in the horns, and all musicians, and especially horn players, know what the horns represent. They symbolize the hunting. And later on, this melody reveals itself in full glory, and there you hear really military music. The melody pretends even to be a national anthem. It becomes louder and louder. We will hear the melody again, but now it sounds even more vulnerable. It is played in the lower strings, and then something very special happens to this melody. It sounds subtle, but it is very, very concrete. This minor melody transmits to a high register, and there it transforms to its major version, which represents illumination. Theme number 2, the object is now prepared to fuse with theme number 1. This is an obvious act of Russification in music. Let's listen. Transformation. The object is transformed, is prepared to merge with the first theme, the Russian subject. And you will hear them finally sounding together, and they even exchange musical material. Isn't it beautiful? But finally, only the echo of the first theme, the Russian subject, remains on the shifting horizon. The high tone with which the piece started and which symbolizes the shifting horizon of the Russian Empire, that is the very end of this piece. The Russian subject remains as an echo, and it will continue certainly its path, looking for new adventures or conquests. Listen at home to the very end, but I will continue my story. So I hope you have a little bit more knowledge of the themes and what they represent. Leitmotifs, very Wagnerian work. Unfortunately, this piece doesn't only bring us back to the Romantic era, but it also brings us closer to Vladimir Putin, who is strongly, as you know, inspired by the Russian 19th century, when the Russian Empire grew explosively and the Russification policy was initiated. For what purpose was this composition by Borodin originally intended? Borodin wrote it for the occasion of the Silver Jubilee in 1880 of Tsar Alexander II, who we know as Alexander the Liberator because he abolished serfdom. But this Alexander was not a liberator for everyone. On the contrary, it was under this Tsar that the Russian Empire expanded in Central Asia and the Caucasus. This process was accompanied by a lot of violence, oppression, Russification, and purges. For example, there was in the 60s an ethnical cleansing of the Caucasus from Caucasian Circassians. These black pages are now almost forgotten. And we may ask, was Borodin aware of the dark side of Russian imperialism? We may assume that news reports also in his time were heavily glossed over. Fake news is timeless. With the steppes of Central Asia, Borodin put Russia on the map as a peace-loving superpower. This work denies the cruelties of the expansion, or to put it even more bluntly, it tells us a lie wrapped up in seductive and dreamy music, and thus it contributes to Russia's image as a protecting force that also on this very day legitimizes its war in Ukraine. A piece like this keeps the vicious circle of ignorance, denial, and violence intact. What to do? I think the Russians say, что делать? Should we cancel this piece from our concert stages? No, certainly not. But I do consider that it's crucial that we listen from now with background knowledge to a piece like this. Of course, it is a painful awakening, but it can trigger an awareness. Think of it as a form of collective therapy. I think that's exactly what we need, both Russians and we here in the West. We can only allow ourselves to perform and to listen to a piece like this if we are willing to open our ears to the historical facts. But how do Russians get to those facts? Now disinformation dictates Russian education and media. Here in the West, it is also difficult to embed a piece like this in a realistic historical context. As a teacher of international groups of students, I know how little basic historical knowledge there is in general. Their knowledge of the Russian past and culture is in general extremely poor. Many musicians just want to make beautiful music. They want to rock themselves to sleep with the idea that music always is above politics. This desire is very understandable. It's natural to look for places to shelter, and music can offer us such a place. However, it is up to me to educate my pupils about the inconvenient truth. I consider it about the inconvenient truth between and behind the notes of some compositions they love. I consider it my task to tell them about the black pages of world history and the debatable role that music sometimes plays in this context. To end my story, it's up to all of us to choose. Do we use this kind of seductive music to rock ourselves asleep in the vicious circle? Or do we choose to play and to listen consciously our way out of this circle? And last but not least, we've just been listening to two themes, a subject and an object. Which theme resonates in you and in me? The subject, the object, or maybe the two together? Thank you for your attention.